We've got breaking news on the Buffalo Sabres. Tage Thompson is signing a long-term extension. We've got the details and the takeaways for what this means for Thompson and the Sabres coming up here in the Locked On Sabres podcast.
Your Locked On Sabres, your daily podcast on the Buffalo Sabres. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Sabres your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. Joe DiBiase flying solo on a breaking news edition of the show here. We recorded earlier on Tuesday afternoon, and just shortly after we were all wrapped up, the Sabres announced a new contract extension for Sabres center Tage Thompson. It is a 7-year extension worth $7.1 million per year, $50 million. And it keeps him under contract through the 2029-2030 season, taking Thompson to age 32 on this current deal. Takeaways from it coming up here on the show, and just kind of the surprise factor of it happening right now in the middle. Well, I guess we're at the end of August, heading into September. At Sneaky Joe Sports, you want to follow me on Twitter at Locked On Sabres for the podcast account. Be sure to check us out on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the show wherever you may be listening, and leave a review. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you may be listening. Be sure to drop a review. So Thompson signs a 7-year deal. How this deal works is one more year at $1.4 million, then the extension begins in 2023-2024. So the finish is out, the current contract, and then the new extension will kick in. He was set to become a restricted free agent after this coming season. And it would have been one of those deals like with Sam Reinhart, where he could have told the team, I don't think this would happen with Thompson, but he could have said it. I'm only signing a 1-year deal, and you're walking me to UFA status. And at that point, you lose all the leverage. So with that in mind, it made some sense the Sabres would do this now. Kind of interesting that we didn't hear any noise about this, though, until it really just happened. Chad DiDomenicis, I think, was the first one to it early on Tuesday afternoon. And within a couple of hours, boom, there was the extension officially signed and announced by the team. So one more year at $1.4 million, then 7 years at $7.1 million. So he's under contract now for 8 seasons. This is a calculated risk by the Sabres and GM Kevin Adams. If Tage Thompson does not revert to the player he once was or regress in a major way, which is possible, he has only been this player, this level of player, for 1 season. He had 3 years in the league, 2 of them more so half years, and then the 2018-19 campaign with the Sabres where he played 65 games. He had 3 years in the league where he scored a combined 18 goals in 3 years. This past year, he scored 38 goals. That is a massive step forward. He went from a career 7% shooting percentage guy, again, in a small sample size of about 140 games, to last year, 15%. His shot percentage doubled. He overnight went from one of the worst finishers in the league to one of the best finishers in the league. I think a lot of that had to do with Don Granato's decision to move Thompson to center. And I think there's a formula here that's been figured out with Tage, that he's now in the right position. He never was. He was misused by coaches time after time because the coach, whether it be Housley or Kruger or his college coach, would fall in love with the 6'7" frame and 220 pounds. The big physical power forward. I think coaches look at him and think, I can turn him into Eric Lindros. I could turn him into Milan Lucic. I could turn him into one of these great power forwards, whether it be from this era or the last era. And Granato, I think very, very intelligently looked at Thompson and said, it's not the player he is. I'm ignoring the size. I don't care that he's 6'7". He's a skilled guy. He wants to be in open ice. He doesn't want to be along the wall. He doesn't want to be battling in front of the net. He wants to be in the scoring areas and use that frame only to get leverage on his shot. And we've seen now in a full season from Thompson last year that his size only gives him really one advantage, and that advantage is getting the amount of torque that he does on his shot and has allowed him to create the finish that he now has. But in terms of his physicality and being a power forward, throw that out the window. And Don Granato did throw that out the window, and it's no coincidence that he got the most out of him tenfold compared to his predecessors. So an increase in ice time helped that along as well. But as of right now, he's the number one center. He's the number one center on the team. Is he a legit number one center in the NHL? No. The assist total is not nearly high enough to call him that. 30 assists in 78 games. You are not a legit number one center in the NHL with 30 assists. You could be a number two guy, putting up the stat line he did last year, being the player he was last year. But I think if this team ever gets great, he's not the number one center. He's the number two. And either Matthew Savoy has leapfrogged him, Dylan Cousins has leapfrogged him, maybe it's Noah Osland or Yuri Kulich. I think in an ideal world, Thompson is your second line center. He's a power play guy. He can use his shot on the wall there. He's a guy that can put the puck in the back of the net, but is not asked to be that all-around guy. He's not there as a playmaker. I don't know if he'll ever get there as a playmaker. I kind of doubt that he will, but he's already proven us wrong once. And he's also a pretty bad defensive player. So he's a great scorer. He's a great scorer. And I think that's the most you're going to get. But is that worth 7 years, $7.1 million? If he remains that player, doesn't take a step forward as a playmaker, doesn't take a step forward as a defensive player, still worth it. Because $7.1 million, it's not as bad as it used to be. And the cap is only going to go up. I know in the NHL it's been very modest. Did it go up $1.5 million this offseason? It wasn't much. But in the future, 5 years from now, when we're only 4 years into that Thompson contract, $7.1 million by cap percentage is not going to be all that much. So I think this was a calculated risk by the Sabres. You are risking looking like a joke. That's the downside. The downside is he does revert. He goes to 15 goals. The shot percentage comes way down. He still doesn't have it as a playmaker. He doesn't have it as a defensive player. If that happens, and it could, it's only been 1 year of this player. If that happens, then they look like a joke. They look pathetic because it'll look like you were so desperate for the Ryan O'Reilly trade to work. You saw one good year and you committed 8 years to that. 7-year extension, but an 8-year in totality, you committed to that. And $50 million, you're going to look bad if that happens. I think it was smart, though, by the Sabres. Take on that risk. Don't worry about perception. Take on that risk, although it would be an anchor. It's not just perception. It would be harmful to their cap build going forward if Thompson doesn't remain the player that he was last season. But I think perception shouldn't matter here. I think this was, in some ways, a smart move. It's not a perfect move, but I understand why they did it. They did it because in 3-4 years' time, if he remains this player, that $7.1 million is a great value. And they're essentially saying, we're going to sign him 1 year before we really should, and we're going to save $2.5-3 million per year because of it. If he went out there and had another 40-goal season, another 35-plus goal season, we're talking about $8.5-9 million at least. So, and maybe more, maybe close to 10. I don't know how high it could have gotten. I think the Sabres are saying to themselves, we think this is Tage Thompson. Let's do it now. We know there's a chance that he regresses, but if he doesn't, we're going to save $2.5 million per year by taking on that risk and doing this contract right now. The last thing that it really does for me as a signing, it is confirmation the Sabres are going to be willing to spend money. And there was reason to believe the Sabres weren't going to be spending money. The Ben Bishop contract trade. I mean, that was a sign of a guy that had no salary left on his deal, but he did have a cap hit that helped them reach the floor that They don't really want to spend money this offseason. They want to be cap compliant, spending the least amount of money as possible. But here is a commitment. Here's a commitment to Thompson. Here's a commitment to spending. And they were going to have to spend on somebody eventually anyway. So it's at least some commitment from the Sabres that they're not going to be bare bones forever here on their build. So Tage Thompson, 7 years, $50 million, $7.1 million per year. We are going to take a moment here to thank our sponsors. Message from RHTSA. Are you one of those people who thinks it's okay to drive stoned? What's the worst that can happen? You end up driving below the speed limit. It's no big deal, right? Wrong. The truth is your reaction times slow way down when you're high. You're not only putting yourself in danger, but everyone around you. Talk about a buzzkill. Stop kidding yourself. It's not okay to drive high. If you've been using marijuana in any form, do not get behind the wheel. If you feel different, you drive different. Drive high, get a DUI. We are also brought to you by betonline.net. They have over-unders up. We'll talk about that on our next show for the Sabres. Over-under point totals for the Sabres in 2022-23. BetOnline is your number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season, from all the latest football league developments, game matchups, news, podcasts, including this year's opening week's games, live betting, esports, golf, Major League Baseball. Head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. We'll talk about those over-unders on our next show. More fallout from the Tage Thompson signing. We'll get Jordan Hanskin's opinion on that and any more news that comes our way. We're still waiting on an Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen contract to happen with the Sabres. We'll keep you updated throughout the offseason here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. Thanks, everybody, for making us your first listen every day. Now go make your second listen, Locked On NHL. Locked On experts giving you a daily 30-minute podcast on all things NHL all year long. Stay up to date on everything in the hockey world. Locked On NHL, your daily 30-minute NHL podcast.